Principal with WRT here in San Francisco, and I'm very excited to be here tonight and to see all of you. This is such a terrific showing, but I'm really excited about the topic, the New Landscape Declaration, and the ideas that are in the declaration, and then these four terrific panelists that we have tonight that are going to talk about how climate change is viewed within their practices and their academic work. So we've got a lot to cover, and it's going to be really interesting, and I'm going to try to make my part fairly brief, and I'm also going to introduce the panelists after I'm finished with an initial presentation about the New Landscape Declaration, so that that introduction is more immediate in everyone's minds when they start speaking. So the New Landscape Declaration, this was something that was produced by the Landscape Architecture Foundation, and I want to talk a little bit about what this organization is to some of you that may not know. Before I joined the LAF as a board member, I honestly didn't know that much about what they did, I'm ashamed to say. And I've learned a lot during my time on the board, and it's such a great organization with such a great mission. So I hope you can all learn a little bit more about that this evening. It was founded in 1966. It's a nonprofit. And its mission is to support preservation, improvement, and enhancement of the environment. Really nice, simple mission. They have increased their collective capacity. They've increased our collective capacity as landscape architects to achieve sustainability in a couple of important ways. One is by investing almost $3 million in research since 1986. A lot of you are familiar with the Landscape Performance Series and the Case Study Initiative, which really looks in detail at landscape architecture projects and how they're performing against the design criteria that they were set out to address. And the LAF has also awarded $1.25 million in scholarships to over 500 students, something that we're particularly proud of. Before I start talking about the new declaration and the summit that we had 2 summers ago, I want to talk about how the organization started in 1966. And it was started by Ian McHarg and a group of very prominent landscape architects who you can see on this list: Campbell Miller, Grady Clay, Charles Hammond, George Patton, and John Simons. And they got together because they were concerned, and they wrote this declaration of concern. And I really like looking at Ian McHarg's calendar here, and you can see on June 1st, there at the bottom left, he's got the names listed of the people he's meeting with, and then June 2nd on the top right, John Simons, etc. So continuation of those discussions. You can see Carol's wedding on the top left with a question mark. We don't know what that means exactly, or who Carol is. And then at the bottom right, you can see $28.35 for an airfare and $2.30 for a cab. So a nice little window into an era where things were a little more affordable. So what did the original declaration contain? First, it was a one-page document, so that was purposeful to make it simple and digestible and yet impactful. So the first part was about current issues. What are these issues that we're concerned about? And some of the ones that they talk about, just bear with me for a second here. Pollution and silt in our waterways, air pollution in major cities, the increasing urban population being separated from nature, a lot of issues that we've actually made some headway on. Arguably, our rivers are much cleaner, at least in America. The same is not true globally. We've made some headway in cleaning up our air with EPA regulations. But there are different kinds of problems now that weren't anticipated by the original writers, having to do with climate change and sea level rise. So some of these issues have shifted to other areas. The second part of the declaration talked about the agency of landscape architects. Why are we the ones that are charged with doing something about these problems? And so when we looked at the new declaration, we thought that was also an important piece to talk about. And then thirdly, what are the strategies that are going to get us there? And some of the strategies that they talked about 50 years ago were recruitment, education, research, and a nationwide system of communicating the results of research and effective practice. And those are the things that have really been the LAF's mission since the original declaration was written. Those are the programs that are housed within LAF that they've been doing a lot of work on. So that continues to be the case. But how do we redirect that now in the next 50 years? And how do we multiply our effectiveness even more with a very limited number of landscape architects? So here we are 50 years after that original declaration, and the purpose of this gathering, the summit, and how many people were at the Landscape Summit in Philadelphia? Okay, a few of you. Great. The purpose of the gathering was to really look ahead to the next 50 years and rewrite the declaration to address the issues that we need to be focused on for the next 50 years. So the summit was over 2 days. It was held at the University of Pennsylvania. It featured 75 leading thinkers and influencers, and there were over 700 attendees. The first day was the reading of 25 sort of preliminary declarations that are actually featured now in a new book, the New Landscape Declaration, and they're also on the LAF website. And if you get a chance to read these essays, it's really worth it. It's a real view into the minds of some of the leading thinkers in our profession, and they're extremely well written and thoughtful, and they were really the material that went into creating the new declaration. So how do we amplify the effectiveness of a relatively small number of landscape architects, 22,500 of us at the last count, as compared to larger numbers in other professions? But how can we really be effective despite the small size of our profession? So I'm going to play a short clip here, just to give you a flavor of what the summit was like.
People a month are moving to cities looking for a better life.
We are nearing the point of no return when it comes to reversing or even mitigating the adverse effects of climate change.
Not all people are being affected evenly.
Landscape architecture, by dealing with public space, dealing with environmental issues, dealing with public space in the most poorest areas, I think it's a social equalizer, and also it's a degree of environmental justice.
We're working with a medium that is that's about atmosphere and temperature and mood and season and sound and tactility and how people interact and the sort of the joys and pleasures of being outdoors with other people.
I'm interested in building publics, not projects. And I'm interested in places where people and citizens are actively involved in making spaces and in resetting ecologies.
Landscape wasn't a sauce you poured over buildings to make them taste good. You know, in a nested order of things, architecture exists within the larger order in the context of landscape, the way furniture does in a room.
If there was the age of engineering and then there's the age of this is the age of landscape architecture.
Have a new way of dealing with cities, with regions, to cultivate a new way of landscape architecture, a new way of doing planning, new way of doing economics. So we need a revolution.
Great. So there's a lot of information on LAF's website from the summit. As I said, if you're interested in the original essays, there's actually a 20-minute documentary about the summit that was produced by some of the UPenn students. It's really well done. So if you're interested in that, please check it out. And the book, as I said, is really nicely done. That's available on the ASLA bookstore as well as on Amazon. So what is the Declaration? It's, as I said, a synthesis of the ideas from the summit. It's modeled after the original Declaration. It was intended to be inspiring, urgent, effective, and emotionally connecting. It's meant to be historic and a clear call to action for all landscape architects. And it's also meant to be readable to the layperson, so that it's not only a technical designer that should understand it, but anyone that feels passionately about social equity or climate change should be able to relate to this document. So those were the goals that were set out. I'm not going to read this, which is about its content. I'm just going to read the Declaration itself. So if you will just bear with me for a couple of minutes, I'm going to just clip through the different parts of the Declaration. So on June 10th to 11th, 2016, over 700 landscape architects with shared concern for the future were assembled by the Landscape Architecture Foundation at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Inspired by LAF's 1966 Declaration of Concern, we crafted a new vision for landscape architecture for the 21st century. This is our call to action. Across borders and beyond walls, from city centers to the last wilderness, humanity's common ground is the landscape itself. Food, water, oxygen, everything that sustains us comes from and returns to the landscape. What we do for our landscapes, we ultimately do to ourselves. The profession changed with designing the profession charged with designing this common ground is landscape architecture. After centuries of mistakenly believing we could exploit nature without consequence, we have now entered an age of extreme climate change marked by rising seas, resource depletion, desertification, and unprecedented rates of species extinction. Set against the global phenomena of accelerating consumption, urbanization, and inequality, these influences disproportionately affect the poor and will impact everyone, everywhere. Simultaneously, there is profound hope for the future as we begin to understand the true complexity and holistic nature of the Earth system, and as we begin to appreciate humanity's role as integral to its stability and productivity, we can build a new identity for society as a constructive part of nature. The urgent challenge before us is to redesign our communities in the context of their bioregional landscapes, enabling them to adapt to climate change and mitigate its root causes. As designers versed in both environmental and cultural systems, landscape architects are uniquely positioned to bring related professions together into new alliances to address complex social and ecological problems. Landscape architects bring different and often competing interests together so as to give artistic, physical form and integrated function to the ideals of equity, sustainability, resiliency, and democracy. As landscape architects, we vow to create places that serve the higher purpose of social and ecological justice for all peoples and all species. We vow to create places that nourish our deepest needs for communion with the natural world and with one another. We vow to serve the health and well-being of all communities. To fulfill these promises, we will work to strengthen and diversify our global capacity as a profession. We will work to cultivate a bold culture of inclusive leadership, advocacy, and activism in our ranks. We will work to raise awareness of landscape architecture's vital contribution. We will work to support research and champion new practices that result in design innovation and policy transformation. We pledge our services. We seek commitment and action from those who share our concern. So here we are, and the next steps are to have conversations. So that's exactly what we want to do tonight. There are other ways to get involved to support not only the declaration, but some of the other initiatives that LAF is undertaking. But I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there, so I really invite everybody to visit the website and see what resonates with each of you. There have been a lot of new activities that have been catalyzed by this declaration. A lot of local organizations, youth organizations, local chapter actions that are trying to extend these ideas and actions around the new declaration. So that's been really encouraging. So I want to introduce our panel now. And then we'd like to start with, I'm just going to pose some general questions, but the panel is not strictly limited to answering those. They can reflect a little bit more on, in their own ways. So I am very pleased to present Jacinta McCann, who is Executive VP. She's a FASLA. She's Executive VP with AECOM, and she is an LAF Board Emeritus. Amir Gohar, who's a PhD and instructor and lecturer at UC Berkeley. Alan Greenspan, ASLA, who's a principal at PWP, and LAF president this year. So we're really pleased to have him here today. And Brian Jencek. I've been practicing. ASLA, Senior VP and Director of Planning at HOK, and also an LAF Board member. And I am sorry to say that one of our panelists, Lindy Lowe, who is the Resilience Program Director at Port of San Francisco, was running quite late this evening. She may show up later, and if she does, we're going to welcome her to the panelist table. She may not make it, so she was going to do her best. So if the panelists could please come to the front and take your seats. And I'm going to just, as you do that, I'm going to pose a number of questions. What can we all do about this? We understand our charge. We need to do something about climate change, but what exactly can we do? What can I do as one type of practitioner? What can you do as another type of practitioner? And so I think that's what we're hoping for our panel to talk about this evening. How is climate change changing the practice of landscape architecture? And how is it altering our clients and projects, reducing certain project types, and opening up new avenues to others? How is climate change affecting your practice, your agency, and your process? How is climate change informing pedagogy and how universities prepare students for practice? And how is climate change affecting your hiring? Are you finding new hires equipped with the tools and methods needed to address climate change, or does this training happen in offices? So, let me pose a couple of more. What are ways, Brian was supposed to do this originally, so bear with me. What are ways in which each of us as landscape architects at all scales of work can address climate change issues in our everyday work? And maybe that's something we can talk more about in the Q&A and discussion that follows. And what are common issues and opportunities associated with climate change that occur across scales and types of work? So I think we're going to begin with Jacinta. Please go ahead.
Questions 6, 7, and 8. Yes, that's right.
Look, I'll use this. Okay, can everyone hear me? Now, I think we were given 2 minutes to introduce ourselves and to make some points about...
2 to 4.
2 to 4, okay. So I'm not sure I'm going to actually answer all those questions, but I will just start with a couple of points, and maybe we can just run through a couple of those questions as a group afterwards, if that makes sense. So look, I just want to start by recognizing how important the Landscape Architecture Foundation has been for our practice in our firm. And if you don't use the Landscape Performance Series and some of the other tools and techniques and great thought leadership on the LAF website, you really should do that. It can have a profound impact on the way we all practice. The Landscape Declaration, I would just jump ahead to one of these questions. I really believe everyone should have this printed off, and you should make a point of reading it regularly. Every time I read it, there's a new phrase that sort of I pick out that seems to mean a lot to me today. And you know, the phrase that leapt out for me today was, you know, what we do to our landscapes, we're ultimately doing to ourselves. And, you know, I just think that resonates with the title of tonight's dialogue. And so please use it, and, you know, use it to inspire yourself, use it to frame how we look at the next 50 years going forward. I think when I was asked to be on the panel, apart from being a long-serving LAF board member, was really to provide some perspective from the standpoint of a landscape architect who, for more than 25 years now, has worked with EDOR and now AECOM. And when we were EDOR, we were the elephant in the room, and there are some EDOR alumni in the room here who would remember that. We were always considered the biggest, and how could we possibly, you know, be thoughtful designers, you know, be responsive to all the issues in the environment. And of course now with AECOM, you know, we have a completely different scale in which we are working as landscape architects. And we have 500 landscape architects inside the firm around the globe. And I would say of the work that, or I would say the response that the firm has to climate change has produced an extraordinary opportunity for every one of those 500 landscape architects, because we, just like you all do with all the people you collaborate with across other disciplines outside your firms, we have this opportunity inside our firm to really drive the way in which we think about urban infrastructure and the way in which we bring an understanding of the really complex issues that you need to navigate to our projects and to the teams and the projects. So I like to think about our 500 landscape architects as people who are fundamentally changing in the urgency of what we are doing now, are fundamentally changing and influencing the way in which very large projects are being undertaken by the other 80,000, 81,000 people. So I'm going to stop there because I think there are specific things I could talk about with to the questions, but I think we should all talk and then go to the more detail on the questions. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Jacinta.
This, and Jim did a fantastic, I think, presentation of the declaration and what LAF is interested in. I think the thing that's been fantastic for me has been how collaborative and open the exchange of ideas has been working with LAF, and that we can have moments like this where we talk about issues that we're all concerned about and talk about how each of us works. And in some ways, and at some times, maybe our firms might compete for the same projects, but at the same time, or the same people for that matter, but at the same time, we're interested in achieving shared goals. And so I think I moderated a panel at the summit that Jim showed the video on, and my panel topic was called Aesthetics. And that was not named by me, but was named, we think, by Richard Weller, who's the chair at Penn, which is where Ian McHarg taught and where I went to school. But right now I'm a partner at PWP Landscape Architecture, and for people that don't know what that stands for, it's Peter Walker and Partners, which might circle back to why my panel was called Aesthetics. And I think really when we hear about landscape architecture today, everyone's interested in, as I am, the function of the landscapes that we design, not just making things look pretty. And I think that sometimes the way that my office can be thought of is as a firm that's focused on making things look good. And I think the challenge that we have, is working in the public realm oftentimes or the private realm and creating environmental design pieces that can communicate to the people that use them while also creating and performing in ways that help both society and the environment. And that's what we've been trying to do at PWP, is really take the heritage and the experience of working to create places that people notice and that people remember. But I think now we're trying to make places that people notice and remember and cherish, that they then might learn something from, notice something about, sort of experience something that they wouldn't have experienced if it hadn't been for that work of landscape. And so I think the challenge that we all have is not doing something that's focused only on creating a piece of urban infrastructure or landscape infrastructure or a performing landscape, but something that both works and communicates, really that has impact and drama, so that what we put into the world is worth the time and the effort and the money that we spend to do that. So that's sort of the background where we are, and what we're trying to do at our place, but also I think what we're all engaged in trying to do together.
I wasn't cycling through your slides, but I did right at the end there. So.
Right. And the reason I had slides is because what we're trying to do, and if you flip forward two more, say, for example, this is Barangaroo Headland Park in Sydney, Australia. And this is a waterfront edge about 1 kilometer long, and you can see that edge of the waterfront is made by giant sandstone blocks that were quarried from the site there. And what that waterfront edge does is creates something that is identifiable, memorable, something that people really can come back to, but also something that'll register and change over time, both through the days, with high tide and low tide, but also with rising seas over the longer term, and something that will become a register and a sort of landmark in a way for people to think about and notice the changes that are going on so that maybe they can act in ways like we're talking about tonight.
Adam, and I think we're going to go right
Okay. Before we flip through these 4 slides, it's a great pleasure, honor, and also a responsibility to be here, and very pleased to see so many familiar faces. I'm going to respond to a couple of questions before we go through these slides. These slides has a little bit of my own summary of experience working in areas that are environmentally sensitive in open landscapes. But before we go to the slides, I will answer 2 specific questions, one about the academia, and I think in Berkeley, at least where I know, there is a lot of emphasis on climate change. Students are working on fire modeling. I'm taking students next week to a field trip to see the Sonoma and the North California fire. They're also working a lot on using remote sensing and satellite imagery on sea level rise and trying to see how that conflict with current development trends and where the vulnerable areas are. So I think from my exposure to UC Berkeley and other universities here, definitely cannot generalize, but there is a lot of good effort being done by dedicated professors to the discipline and to respond to that. The other point I'll mention after we go through the slides. So I want us to go to, can you flip? I think that in order to look at climate change and how can we face that, we need to break some barriers that are preset, because it's a very global phenomena and it moves across so many countries, so many boundaries, so many disciplines. So first thing I think we should do is to think across scales. This is an area, a very environmentally sensitive areas with mangrove and coral reef in the Red Sea that I worked on. And if I zoom out a little bit on a higher scale, I find this is an island on the western shore of the Red Sea in Egypt. And while I spent so much time trying to protect this coral reef and from whether it's capitalist development or diving operators, or I realized that I thought I did a lot of contribution to protect the biodiversity and the Red Sea ecosystem. Then, can you zoom out one more? Then I was asked to fly to the other side of the Red Sea to do another landscape work on a waterfront development, and I find some settlements has no sewage system. So I started to realize that all the time I'm trying to protect the coral reef that inch, every inch of the coral reef, there is a huge other side in a completely different country that is destroying as 100 times of what I'm trying to protect. And that enlightened me the importance of to look across borders, look across scales. We can't just stay in our own bubble, making it cleaner, 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 while the bubbles around us are having different perspective on things. The other thing is to think across institutions. There are people who work for national parks and focusing on protecting the trees and protecting the forests, etc. But there are other institutions and other companies and other organizations that probably have, by design, a conflicting mandate. So it's also very important to look at different institutions, try to reach out to those who we typically or usually label as the polluters, the industrials, the people who do things wrong. So I'm always against the idea that we distance ourselves from those who are creating the damage, but rather dialogue with them in order to have a better understanding and better solutions to the climate. The third takeaway, I would say, this is on the... So this is, we're usually tasked to design a resort or to do a garden or to do a park without very much looking at other surroundings and stakeholders, and we're always bound by, we probably have some room for that, but we're bound by time and budget, and your boss wants you to do the right, submit on time and print the panels on time. But in the process of doing our job right, we sometimes, some details fall outside the context or outside the specific picture that we spend all our time trying to enhance and improve. There are probably, it encourages us to rethink where to put our time and effort. The third one is to think across disciplines. Under the notion of being very specialized landscape architects, I always heard this argument that we're in conflict with engineers, and the architects are focusing on the details, but we are the one who masters everything and see the bigger picture. In fact, the lines, in my views, between these disciplines, architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, city planning, regional planning, land use planning, it's drawn in a very rigid way that I would encourage that they need to be a little bit blurry. We need to talk to people who coordinate better and to have better coordination and better development. The fourth takeaway, this is just another way of aligning and looking at coral reef, floodplains, where to place. Because I've worked with architects who are very much focused on trying to maximize the benefits and the ventilation, but all their building is situated in a floodplain. And it's going to flood in 6 years based on the climate cycle. So they are so much trying to enhance something that will be washed away. And they think water flooding in an arid area is not very destructive. I can tell you, done research and worked a lot and witnessed boulder as big as Fiat 500 hitting your house at a speed of 80 kilometers, 60 miles. So it's not about it's dry or not usually flooding. Boulders of granite as big as the Fiat 500 can create a lot of destruction because of the flooding. The fourth, I have two more, is to learn from the local knowledge and local people and local residents and try to engage them in the process, because I'm always scared of that notion that we know more or we know better. And many of you work internationally, work in big firms, and you fly to the Middle East, you fly to Africa, you fly to China. Your role and responsibility is to engage those who know a little bit more, if not more, than what you know from reading the maps within your short period of the project. Sorry, I'm taking time. The last one is to work with other partners who we never think they could be there, working on the same objectives and the same goals. And if we go to the other slide, so for example, if the LAF didn't exist in 1966 and the declaration didn't exist at all, what is going on recently? So the Sustainable Development Goals, not that I agree with all of them or many of them, I know how they work really well, and that I have my own reserves on them. But there are other efforts beyond our circle. There are other people who are concerned about the same thing, like the ocean, the sustainable cities, equalities, and it's very important to align these forces in order to be able to protect our natural resources, protect biodiversity, and protect ourselves from the climate change that's happening. Thank you very much.
Really well said. Thank you.
Thanks.
And last but not least, Brian Jencek.
Thanks, Jim. Well, so I remember, Adam, maybe you do too, after the summit, we were in Philly heading back in a cab. I think Mia was there too in the cab in the back with us. And, you know, we were trying to digest what had just happened there at the summit and the kind of the heaviness and depth of the topics that were before us. And I remember there was a lot of excitement, but at the same time it was like, how on earth do you actually put this to practice? We've got budgets and clients and deadlines and finite site boundaries. We've got constraints galore. So how do you approach this? So just quickly I just want to share with everybody two ways in which we've done it. Now, first off, to be clear, I wasn't supposed to be a panelist here, so I'm not exactly as prepared maybe as I should be. I'm also going to be presenting Rowana and Kyle's work and others here. Two projects, one here in the Bay Area, just down the street, that answers a fundamental question. Okay, Jim, how do we actually put all these things to work? At a residential scale, at a park scale, community scale, waterfront scale, right? Like, what do we actually do? How do we do that within the finite constraints of our projects? And then we'll go to the other side of the world. So, you can't think about the Bayview neighborhood without thinking about environmental injustice issues, right? And so, this is one of those communities which has one of the least amounts of open space per zip code. The reason I linger on this slide is we start to wonder as planners and landscape architects, like, how can we use the tools that we have, in our offices to actually help communities where we could have the greatest impact? And so this is where, GIS kind of looks hard at Bayview. We also, I don't have to tell everybody in this room, it also coincides with where most of the undeveloped industrial land is. So lo and behold, surprise, surprise, most of the development that's coming at San Francisco in the next 15 years, where is it going? So there's a coincidence there. So, as the major projects all along the eastern waterfront are building out, the water's coming in, and what do? And thankfully, we have Resilient by Design, which I know that Jacinta and other teams, there's Kevin in here, you know, we're all a big part of here. But we also have issues. We need housing, and a lot of it. You know, we need transportation systems, and where does all that go? So there's this incredible rub. For the last year, we've been working with the city of San Francisco, the Bayview neighborhood. Again, Ron has been leading this effort, looking at mapping, where's the available land where you can actually do something? How is it being affected by sea level rise and various issues? Water's kind of coming at it from the top as well as from below, and ultimately, how do you create a sense of community out of all that, right? So, you know, one of the big lessons that we've learned, of course, and I think Resilient by Design is another great platform, is it takes a tremendous amount of advocacy and outreach. You know, there's a lot of education, both of ourselves and our teams, as well as our clients, and certainly the community. So how do we do that is a huge question, and maybe we'll get into that more during Q&A. You know, ultimately, parks emerge out of that, and this is where the landscape architecture kind of rubber hits the road. But I think we ask ourselves, what can we do, you know, in our own backyard here to actually affect change? On the other side of the world, in Hong Kong, so the Hong Kong waterfront, which maybe, has anybody been to the Hong Kong waterfront by chance over there? Yeah. So second ground plane has been a, you know, phenomenal question, I think, for society for a long time, right? The water's rising, and so do we establish new ground planes? And Hong Kong is famous for having, of course, the elevated walks that take you out to the water. The dark green is a site, and of course, this is the part of the waterfront, if you've been there, that ultimately protects what's called central, or essentially downtown Hong Kong, like our San Francisco, and probably doesn't surprise you that it's also the most prone to sea level rise. Dark blue represents various levels at which water will inundate the city. So this was an interesting project. We always wonder, like, will our private development projects allow us to deal with these issues of social inequity, climate change, environmental justice? Will it be civic projects? Will it be publicly funded projects? Where's Jacob? Who's going to pay for this, right? So ultimately, this was a case of bringing a massive public civic investment to the waterfront. Hong Kong, you can't think about it without thinking about water. So what if we actually placed their equivalent of a city hall, the big building there, on the water and actually used it to fund a massive infrastructure project, the removal of a highway, and then use the spoils from a new tunnel to create a massive new waterfront. So I'm sure a lot of you have been to the Hong Kong waterfront, which is just finishing up. How do you deal with issues of access? Some people have access to the waterfront who have certain means and certain access and abilities, others don't. How do you deal with urbanization? You know, we're growing, and so there's a lot of pressures on our waterfronts and just available land in general, whether it's Bayview or in Hong Kong. So, you know, how do we make sure that open space stays central to the picture? In Hong Kong, there aren't yards, right? Front yards, backyards, we don't have that. So how can these amazing new projects not only deal with massive infrastructural issues, which Jacinta touched on, but also provide open space and placemaking for cities? You know, actually reconnect cities to their water and do all those things, right, which we've all been taught. But how do you actually fund it? Well, projects like these are where we bring together massive infrastructure with civic projects where you get to the core of like a city's identity. Civic investment isn't thinking about when it's going to flip, right? It's not on the developer track. There isn't a 7-year economic cycle, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, it's kind of interesting. You know, we're working both with communities on kind of bootstrap budgets as well as with cities investing in larger municipal waterfronts. You know, social inequity, of course, you know, comes to the fore. So again, who actually has open space in Hong Kong is directly tied to who has money. And so providing a front yard for a city, whether it's here in San Francisco or on the other side of the earth, these are powerful gestures where people can actually hang out, learn how to, you know, throw a Frisbee, ride a bike, and they're doing all that on a waterfront that's built to protect a city. So now we're getting multifunction. That's another thing that I think we're getting out of this. How do you sponsor community amidst all that? Like, where do we talk about celebration and community amidst these heavy issues of climate change and SLR? Ultimately, it's about reconnecting, and but it's also like now suddenly we get ourselves, you know, there's more political unrest in the world than ever before, and I think Amir was hitting on, right? And so now suddenly all these kind of good notions that we all have, when they're suddenly put to work, now suddenly we have to deal with things like this. And so I don't know how many people have had their park tear gassed, but that happened to us during the umbrella protests. And so now suddenly we realize a big piece of lawn along a water intended to protect a city becomes a place for expression because there wasn't any previously. And oh my gosh, now we're actually starting to discuss and get into dialogue about democracy in sometimes great and sometimes painful ways. For me, these were all inspirations came from the New Landscape Declaration, where we really think about like, okay, first off, post-rationalization, where do our projects kind of touch these issues? And then going forward, how do we turn the levers that actually allow us to affect change in positive ways? You don't talk about climate change and sea level rise with all the doom and gloom. I think it's important to talk about at the end of the day, you know, we create special, amazing moments throughout all of this. We're going to protect cities, we're going to relocate infrastructure, we're going to get entitlements, we're going to go through bonds, all those things. But at the end of the day, you know, First Kisses is a darn good reason to actually create amazing open space. And so I think maybe I'll stop at First Kisses.
Great, thank you, Brian. So I want to open this up to all of you, and I kind of just want to hear what's on people's mind. Let's not try to be overly regulated here. If you have a thought about how we can collectively be more effective as landscape architects, talk about that. If you have questions for our panel, you want to direct it at any one of them, go ahead and do that. If you have thoughts about how you, in your practice, are affecting climate change, something that all of us can learn from, talk about that. So let's have this be a little bit of free form, a little bit of a dialogue. So what's on your mind?
I can lead off if you guys like.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think, we've had about 18 months now of the declaration in process, and I think there's a very profound change that I see permeating all of the work that we're doing. And I think there is a sort of a tidal wave of change that is required, that is coming with the adaptation that's needed to climate change. And if you look back and think back to the late 90s when sustainability first sort of came along, I felt like that was a tidal wave. This is a completely, that is, I think, small compared to what we're facing now and the urgency of what we're facing. So for me and for the practice that, that I am part of, it's something that is driving how we're thinking. And I would say, just to tie it back to a couple of the questions that you answered, I think it is very clear to us that the landscapes that we design now have to actually work. They have to be beautiful, they have to perform to meet all sorts of other things, but they have to work. They have to be able to adapt over time. We have to be able to provide landscapes that we know are going to actually be able to still be functioning and performing in a way that they need to in the next 20, 30 years, looking out beyond that. Our clients are expecting more because they are more knowledgeable, and they're more knowledgeable about the risks. There are a huge range of risks that everyone's facing now, so that's really critical. And the projects are multidimensional now. I feel like we've got to be hyper leaders. We've got to be hyper collaborators. We've got to push the boundaries. We've got to really be working harder now. And I think there's an amazing opportunity for landscape architects you talked about leadership, and I think I see great examples of landscape architects really assuming stronger leadership, because there is a type of receptivity to what the perspective we bring and the understanding we bring, particularly in these complex areas associated with transitions between land and water. I sit on the BCDC Design Review Board here in the Bay Area, and I see there are probably numerous people here who have brought projects before BCDC, but the landscape architect's ability to deal with that very complex edge and to help guide the way in which everyone thinks is something that is just we have to fill the void and lead. So I'm seeing a real change as a result of this effort. That's great. Thank you.
Well, I can answer personally, but I want to highlight another point. The Landscape Declaration is, I think, a very big change. It's been translated to over 10 languages. I've translated the Arabic one and sent it out to start.
20, I think. Almost 20 now.
20 languages.
Yeah.
So my undergrad degree was a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture that was registered as Bachelor of Urban Planning because there is no body, there is no ASLA in many countries, there is no LAF in many countries. So having that declaration translated, it's a positive meme that will go and be captured by other professors in other universities, and it will spread. And probably what helps it to spread, from some observations, the strong counter climate change that is happening in many governments and many leaderships. So that is actually bringing awareness to the topic and allowing people in many other countries that never considered climate change as a topic or as an issue. So I went through the back and forth in the translation to Arabic, and sometimes the word landscape has no equivalent in other languages. So all I'm saying, I think it's a lot bigger than the sustainability shift, and I see it spreading beyond not only California or the United States, but the memes or the ideas or the values are spreading a lot. I'm answering about my own self. I think I cannot claim that I was in the dark about the environment and the climate change issue turned me upside down and I become 180 degrees dedicated. So the impacts on me is a continuation, and it confirmed and reassured that the values and the morals I've been leading in the past years are correct. So it's not a drastic shift for someone like me who've always engaged with the local community, who's always looked at the local ecosystem, who always looked at environmental biodiversity and environmental settings around me. When I work with landscape architect who's digging a well, even if it's out of my free time, look at where is this water well coming from? Who is it impacting? What's the elevation? And I encountered cases where a water well will suck the groundwater and make it more difficult for another tribal family that is 80 kilometers away from getting their own drinking water because they're on a different elevation. So to me, it wasn't a radical shift, but a reassuring and continuation to something started before. Thanks.
April, go ahead. Come on up. I think that mic is on.
Hi, you guys. Thanks a lot. It's very inspirational, and I hope everybody here has enjoyed tonight. One of the things I want to say is I think we cannot, as you guys said, we cannot do business as usual. You know, we have to be change agents. The world is changing. We have to change with it. And more I'm seeing landscape architects be the leaders of tomorrow by doing that. Put your foot out there. Say something, react, don't just sit back. But I think that's what we used to do a little bit more back in the day as bigger projects. We're just one of the team. It's important to give voice to these thoughts and to what can be. It's a lot easier on the big projects, the ones like the waterfronts. And for example, we're doing Alameda Waterfront. But even then, we have a client who may not be thinking outside the box. But what we like to do as a firm is do a little bit of R&D. So we've invested in the time to take our design, explore it through animation, do the sea level rise 3D. One, it's fun for ourselves, but then we're able to talk in more communicate more in a fun way that makes it more visible to people versus just the typical section, right? Most of us draw the little sections in elevation. So that's usually how we communicate to BCDC, for example. But if you make it fun, make it interesting, you know, we invested in learning how to do a drone, use a drone, and we fly a drone now, and we're trying to investigate it. So I would challenge everybody to kind of go a little bit beyond and think about ways that you can kind of make it more personal, make it more about affecting change, follow that declaration, like you said. We actually shared it just a week ago and said we should read this every month because it's really important. It really pushes you, when you see what Ian McHarg and all these guys wrote, you know, in '66, to think that we're the new generation, we can do that. So I would say, you know, let's do it. But I think it doesn't take too much to just do that little bit extra and explore. We're designers. We want to do it anyway. So think a little bit about how we can do that. And then I think the biggest dilemma we have found is how do you bring that to the smaller projects, right? The day-to-day projects where you feel like you aren't given that opportunity. But sometimes it's so simple. And the other day we were doing a synagogue, and we took maps. The synagogue was built in Marin in 96? Well, we took maps from 1966 and then showed how the area changed, just in 3 or 4 maps, how they were the original land was this beautiful land that fed the march to San Pablo Bay. And then it became a little bit more urban, and then it was really urban, and they're right perched on the mountain. And they got it that they could embrace the mountain and embrace more sustainability in a way that mattered to the past and to the future. So I think, you know, just thinking outside the box a little bit, sometimes just that little bit of things and saying one thing that, and so I'm inspired by you guys every day, and hopefully we can inspire each other and share these kinds of stories, because I think sometimes you think you're the only one, right? And sometimes it's just about reaching out and talking about it. But anyway, I just want to say that, and I want to say thank you.
Those are, great points, April. Thank you for sharing that. Those were really some great points. I want to maybe just highlight a couple things because they're connecting to what others are saying. You know, go out on a limb a little bit, I think is what I hear April saying. And, you know, we're all trained to synthesize complex problems. That's how we were trained as landscape architects. It's not sitting in our little comfort zone, but it's reaching out and connecting with civil engineers and ecologists and others and figuring out complicated things. And I think if we have confidence in that and just step out there and know that we can do that, we can bring those partners in, it really does amplify what we can do. And then with the synagogue, I thought of Adam's presentation too, and the storytelling on the waterfront project that you showed with the sandstone blocks. You know, a small project can communicate a story. It can reveal something about ecology. And it can raise awareness that people that then go out from that small space, you know, can go out and they can do their part to create change. So I think there's a real power there in landscape as storytelling. Other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
Beautiful place.
Well, is there a component for that, I think, is a question to all of us. You know, LAF is very active in scholarship and I think looking now very seriously at going back to middle school to raise awareness, you know, at that age, catching kids before they get into, you know, thinking about career decisions and so forth. But in general, I think, you know, education is a huge issue. So I don't know if any of you want to make a comment. I mean, maybe Amir, since you're the educator of the group, you could speak to that, but it's a huge topic.
I have two daughters, 10 and 14, and they talk to me about climate change and many other things. They talk about politics, leadership, they talk about parties, they talk about, so I'm sure the seed is there. Now, that seed needs to continue growing and be part, and I think this is a collective responsibility. I started a nonprofit in 2010 called Urbanics, and it has a program called UFOK, Urbanics for Our Kids. And UFOK in Arabic means Ufuk, meaning horizon in the Arabic word. And it aims to take students, middle school or primary school students, to open landscapes, wilderness, even if it is not as prepared to receive school trips. But that is a role of nonprofit communities, universities, and as you indicated, all of us. I think it's a good idea, and maybe throw that on you, to have a cartoonish summary of the landscape declaration, maybe it's still in 1 or 2 pages, if there are volunteers to work on that, with showing the sea level rise, the fire, etc., and it can be incorporated within curriculum or extra. Eventually, their goal is to become one of their hardcore science class, but it could start to be as an extra credit or optional, so they get to know a little bit more than the generic titles. So that's probably a collective responsibility.
Good idea. I'm writing it down. Other comments? Go ahead, Brian.
Add on. So I also have a 7-year-old daughter, and right now, whether you have children or not, the public school system here in San Francisco, there's just all these, just tired, underpaid teachers. They would absolutely love, and I'll use Sunnyside Elementary Public School where my daughter goes in Glen Park as an example. They would love for you to come in and spend some time with the children, whether it's your own kid's classroom or whether it's someone else's. I found it incredibly valuable. It's just really interesting to have 7-year-olds ask you important questions about resilience. For someone who's 7, they look at the year 2030, where we know things get a little gnarly for us in the Bay Area, and 2050, where it starts to really go upside down in terms of SLR. They look at it differently because if you're 7, 2020, 2030, 2050, well, it's not so far away. If maybe you're 50, 60, somewhere like that, suddenly 30-year, 50-year time scales, they just mean different things based on where we are in life. So take a moment, to go in and just talk to them. I find it really refreshing as practitioners because their lensing is completely different. They lack tons of bias. And then it also, I think they get quite a kick out of it too.
I was invited to Albany Primary School to talk to them about biodiversity and climate in my daughter's class. And it was fun, and they showed a lot of interest. They asked a lot of difficult questions, a lot of critical questions. My daughter didn't ask because she said, I have puppy at home. But regardless of that, they all have really new angle and new perspective to things. It's just our role to feed that in.
But I think what also has come up in all of this one works too now, our conversations, and I think that what was interesting about developing the declaration among a pretty wide group of people after hearing many other people's declarations at the summit was that it's not going to be something that is pointed and drives each individual necessarily. For me, it's been something that is something you can carry around and then put out and talk to other people, or talk about the profession or the discipline of landscape architecture and what the potential and why landscape architects can be leaders in thinking about the way the world comes together now. And I think when you think about education and young people, how do you educate? Is it by writing things or having panel discussions or giving a lecture, or is it by making a place that exhibits or shows something related to, all of this? And I think one of the things we've been thinking about over the last couple of days in preparation for getting here, maybe some people it's been longer than the last couple of days, is what can we do as landscape architects? And there's all different ways, I think, and it depends on what kind of projects or what kind of tasks you work on. But I think trying to get more and more living systems and planting into each of our projects is one of the things that we've been doing. And here in San Francisco, the great opportunity is that there's a lot of different kinds of plants, for example, that grow here, and they do crazy things through the years. And so when kids happen by something that they didn't see, ever happen before, that can be something that is remarkable and that spurs questioning that then becomes a learning experience, which is all about a physical thing that's made, And I think that's where I think we can get wound up in the rhetoric or the conversation or the discourse about all of this when people are getting further and further away from the woods, And so how do we make places like that for people so that they can learn this? And it came up, Georges Descamps, a landscape architect from Switzerland, was speaking at Berkeley and came by our office one day, and we were working on a park, a civic center at Newport Beach in Southern California. And it was a 16-acre park, public park, around an existing wetland, and it had a bunch of different kinds of eco zones and a trail and a dog park and all this other kind of stuff. But the client had ended up asking that we work on an interpretive signage program. And we did, and we got an illustrator, and we were working on the stories of the landscape. but Georges Jacome liked the project, but he was like, what is this silly, interpretive graphics? He's like, the interpretation is the project. And I think that that's a challenge that we all have, is how can you make the work that you work on, and whether it's a physical piece or a presentation or whatever it is, the interpretation of the concepts that we're talking about. So if we're making places, like April was just talking about, the process of going through the presentations and then the experience of being at the places once they're built are all opportunities for education.
Can I just comment on that? Yeah, sure. I'll report back in a week's time. No problem. We'll solve it. No, but I mean, that's an area which I think we need to be more active on. We need to be influencing people in a way that we really haven't done as a profession. And I think people should step up and do more in that area, really trying to shift the ground on some of these things and support people who are trying to shift the ground. But I also think, and this is a fantastic event tonight, and thank you guys for getting all this set up, because with the acceleration of what needs to be done, we all will do it better if we're all learning from each other, knowing what the best, latest ideas are, and not being shy about sharing knowledge, because we will all move forward faster together and smarter together if we are communicating well with each other about the best way to do things. And there is so much innovation going on right now, so much on the analytics side. And there are great tools, and you're going to develop a new tool, which is great. There are great tools to help us, but those tools give us more time to actually accelerate further and have more impact. So I just think we've got to really work as a team. The profession has to work as a team. And that's, for me, is in a personal sense, that's sort of what I've taken away from it. That's what I'm working really hard on doing, is making sure that, we all work together. Yeah.
Real quick. Oh,
sorry. I just wanted to just shoot in one thing to that question, which is that I don't think LAF is working on policy individually, through the different agencies and places where we might try to make things faster. But one thing that's been a fantastic, I think, development in LAF's efforts over the last few years is a leadership program that we're sponsoring that offers fellowships to practitioners or people related to landscape architecture at various points in their career. And we have one fellow, from CMG, Pamela here, who got it this year. But it's a year-long fellowship with monetary and advising kind of assistance for people that want to look at and try to do something. And actually, one of the people this year, I think, is looking at interfacing with agencies to connect and try to and I can't remember, I just looked at this yesterday, but focus agencies' efforts on changing the requirements related to some of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I would add, one of the things we should all be doing is thinking really carefully how we vote, and we should be voting for people who are going to support climate change and take action for climate change. And there are some things happening at the state level right now that, and some of the senators, they are promoting faster project approval periods, and we should be supporting that. I mean, really talking about it. And so it's a great point that you raised, Gab.
Build on that just a little bit. I know it's hard to make. It's also really intimidating because it covers so much. And also inspiring, but you realize that in a way, it was primarily around environmental issues, and in a way, that well on the scorecard. Wonder how we're going to accomplish the things that are on has to do with relevancy. How can we our own profession it's a small, all really similar actually. We're not like really want to make a big impact. Much stronger about effectiveness.
And I think amplification, in the age of social media, there's some power there to kind of our little. Are there some other thoughts about Kevin's point?
Yeah, I mean, in the room is probably, 10, 20% of the owners of major firms and partners in the Bay Area. So, it starts with us, challenge. If you want to sit on the BCDC, which is amazing, I mean, to have a landscape architect on the BCDC is fantastic, but there's also the Port Design Review Commission, there's the Arts Commission, there's there's lots of different spots for us. And thankfully, a lot of landscape architects are sitting on those commissions already. So we're doing an okay job, but there's a lot to go. And certainly, we don't have many landscape architects in powerful political positions yet. And so that's kind of the next step, though it's starting to happen. We have the first mayors that are landscape architects, Davis and so forth. So it's coming along. So yeah, push the partners and the firms with which you work. If you're passionate about it, say, yeah, I want to sit on the San Francisco Port Design Review Commission. And that's going to take a certain amount of time out of my week. And how does that really work? It's the same thing, right? I mean, we're all here. Everybody made time. So we make time for those things we're passionate about. Mm-hmm. To the other point, and this is something, sorry, I'll make this is my little diatribe. Julie, everybody's had to hear this. Where else? I mean, LAF is the only venue I found so far with Jacinta, Adam, Kate, Mia, Jim. We all just have a raging argument. It has nothing to do with firms and logos and sponsorships, any of that BS, right? We literally can just talk about our practice and profession and argue what we need to be doing and how to position it. Kevin, where will you and I meet? We'll either be competing on a project past each other in the interview hallway, kind of, hey, dude, how you doing? Or we will maybe see each other at the annual conference. That's it. So where is the forum? Yeah. So I just want to pose this question out there as well. When you're also asking for that time to sit on various boards and commissions, why don't you also go ahead, if you find value in what's happening here tonight, and this is just a small kernel of what could be something much greater. You guys know where I'm going with this. I mean, we could do this every month. It'd be easy. It takes 6 firms tops and the thing's sponsored and we're done with it. We could do it like that if we wanted to. But this is where we rise from lots of relatively small, tiny firms that are hyper-competitive and, again, protect intellectual property to start sharing. One of the things I love about the LAF, and maybe ASLA is the same way if I just got more engaged and I want to, But at LAF, it's all out on the table. We share our slide decks. We share intellectual property. It's out there. We have hard conversations, and it's not about the logos. If you like this kind of way of thinking, again, you just press a few leaders, and it'll be done. We'll do this every month.
See, I'm lucky to live in the same city that he does.
That's right.
Past president of ASLA.
And to add on to that, thank you, Liz. It's a perfect venue. We have so many events. It's a perfect venue for discussion, argument, friendship, community. Out to the ASLA events. Yeah, I was going to say, Katrina gave me this.
Uh-huh.
This is something. Post your pictures on Twitter. Let's make this chapter.
Great point.
Well, I don't want to let those two comments slip by. Thank you, ASLA, for saying that. I was listening to Brian talk about, where could we meet, and just do this. And so, yeah, there's a ready-made structure here. So I think it would behoove us to take advantage of the structure that's here. So thank you. Somebody else was going to.
I just wanted
Amir, go ahead.
to stress that it is, responding to your question, I think it is important to make deliberate, conscious decision to connect with other disciplines who could be concerned. Science, marine science, geography, geology, people who are studying flooding, geomorphology, islands, oceans, whales, it's all connected. So going beyond our discipline is one way to disseminate these values. And you will find people speaking the same language. They might not be landscape architects, but they have an overlap with us in some concerns about the environment. The other thing is connecting with other organizations beyond California and beyond the US. So Sustainable Development Goals, I'm not very fan of the UN at all, but there is a Sustainable Development Goal number 13 that says climate action. It's important to reach out and see who's leading that in the United States. What kind of organization? Is it UNEP, UNDP, UN Habitat? Is it the UNESCO? There is a Sustainable Development Goal 14, life underwater. I know it's very broad, less tangible, unlike the way we do things, but there are other people who share the same objective and concern on different degrees of genuinity. They're not necessarily, because it's a buzzword now, so you come across so many people who are pro-climate change, but we can collect forces and build partnership to use that moment to disseminate the values of the declaration. And I'm sure they also don't know, when they meet like us, we do here, they don't know about the Landscape Architecture Declaration much. Here where the social media comes as a good way to make, through our all connections, the word go out.
Can I just add one more thing too? I just want to double the recognition for ASLA because there's also an amazing event every year that ASLA orchestrates in Washington, D.C., which is called Advocacy Day. And you should try and participate in that 1 year in your career, at least. It's an amazing event, and it's something which, is just one of many things that ASLA is doing. So, I really agree with you guys. Let's use what we've got here already. A great leadership, really great group in Northern California, and, use that as the sharing platform. Let's all be a team there. But I totally agree with you. Let's also make sure that we're in other groups and, let's not just speak to the converted all the time. Let's get out of our like-minded, similar-looking people and be with other people.
I got a question. So, what would it take? The ideas there, throwing out. The
Yeah.
Let's have one, but how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, It's a good question. I mean, so far I found the most like agnostic, sort of objective, neutral ground, if you will. Like if we had had this event at HOK, the attendance would have been different. That's just kind of the nature of our profession in kind of unexplainable ways. Spur is an interesting one because it's not ULI. There's not an enormous kind of financial part of it. I'll leave it at that. Spur is an interesting one for us. I think it attracts all types. I see a lot of you at the lunchtime lectures. It attracts not just landscape architects, but our practice in particular leans heavily upon planners and urban designers to lend scale to landscape architects and bigger systems and economics and so forth. I like Spur. But I think it can be, again, it could be joint ASLA and Spur, just like LAF and ASLA. I think ASLA becomes the foundation. I mean, that is our licensure, that is our association, that's our national organization.
Or other nonprofits, or probably public universities. I don't think UC Berkeley would mind having an evening class in the room 112 or such an event. So we should reach out to other.
Yeah, I'm hearing an action from this session that we can talk about later. ASLA, April, UC Berkeley, all of us. Let's put together this idea of a commons. I think this is pretty exciting. I wanted to get a comment in the back there. Yeah.
I think Kevin preempted my question a little bit about, I think a lot of this conversation is great, but some of it is somewhat preaching to the choir.
I mean, just real quick, I mean, one of the healthiest trends that I've seen in the last, only in the last 6 months, we've started to meet with, these are for-profit, quick flip developers, right? So the fastest, kind of shortest horizon developers. And RFPs are now, they're beginning to ask us questions like, who is HOK's climate change expert? Meaning that they now expect landscape architectural practices and planning and urban design to actually have someone there who has an educational or practice background in that. So I find that quite refreshing when the developers with short horizons are as worried about this issue as us.
There have been a lot of sessions throughout the country. The board was sort of charged with going out and disseminating the declaration. So that's happened all over the country in many, many states. And I have not yet heard back any negative feedback from those sessions. It was, you know, exactly the contrary. There's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of folks saying, wow, this is great. What can I do? You know, type of reaction. So I think, you know, again, we're preaching to the choir still. Those audiences are mostly landscape architects. But I think part of our challenge is to first get cohesion amongst us and then to reach out and, you know, connect to other groups. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the idea of the commons because I feel like even though we're like, yes, of course, like this is what we're doing, this is where it's going, there's lots of other people that have no idea what we're talking about. You know, and so it takes a certain amount of like to continue to tell the story, you know, to explain stuff, to explain what we're doing. Having this group to kind of sometimes when you feel like you've finally gotten everyone understanding what you're talking about. And so just having this community to kind of keep your spirits up and to kind of go with a bit of a bubble as far as
And maybe also starting to invite other partners in. You know, it doesn't have to always be, you know, just an internal conversation. So, Sharka. Great point. Yeah, really important. Yeah.
landscape architecture, because these are don't necessarily have any sort of training.
Great. Yeah. How do you sustain the fishery? How do you make it resilient? Cool.
I love the focus of the discussing, but that is like one of the landscape declaration isn't just about what the landscape and what are the issues here. I think about homelessness. Maybe one that's the ways of tying those two issues together. Park user that I feel like is often by our field, but also very vulnerable to climate change. The often their home. Like one thing that's just on my mind is like, how many times do we specify a bench that has the handle in the middle so that people can't lay down and sleep on it? Or one that I heard about recently where now have holes in them so it rains and the rain falls through so that people have that place as a shelter. And I'm just convinced that that's or one of the top Bay Area topics that I don't know, like I want to say as a professional that for all our actions we do, all the things we specify to counter the presence of those profession, to go out on a limb and counteract those actions. So that's for Advocacy Day for thing. I think that would be like a key.
Yes. So you dropped a bomb that I would love to spend another half hour on, but let's at least try to spend a few minutes. I would love for one or more of you to talk about social equity and its importance in the Declaration, including social equity for homeless people. While you're thinking about your answer, I have to tell one of my favorite stories, which is from Neil Hershovy, who was City of San Francisco project manager in charge of the Better Market Street project. And they were just getting started redesigning Market Street. Kevin may know this story. And they were getting a lot of feedback from the community, store owners, stakeholders. And one of the things that came up time and time again is we don't want benches outside because of the homeless problem. And this was consistent throughout. So Neil was presenting this, and he said, so we took this comment very seriously, and we went and we researched it. And what our team found is that benches are not the cause of homelessness.
Really?
You guys want to comment on social equity, homelessness in 2 minutes or less?
In 10 seconds. I think it's very important to understand the processes that produce the homelessness or the social problems. And probably none of that, or majority of that, is not us. There are economic, as she indicated, we need to vote better. We need central governments and local governments to allocate budget for social housing. So we tend to inherit a problem in our public space when we're trying to design it that has People's Park or this bus yard, and that has homeless people that ended up reflecting so many public problems and make it so difficult for people to use the space. So I would rather we allocate, in parallel to trying to design to accommodate the problem, also try to allocate some resources in terms of our time, energy, and advocacy to deal with it at the higher level before it is generated. And that's the only way. It's more a policy, economics, housing formula than the bench and the design. It's both, but it starts up there. So it's good to map it and nail where the problem is and starts with voting better, I think, on all levels.
Much more serious response than mine. Thank you. We are out of time, and I was told that we have a very strict end time here where we're going to get kicked out. So I want to thank our panelists for coming tonight and participating, and I want to thank all of you for coming. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I think we have some follow-up actions, and thank you all very much.